So if you would start out telling us your name and how you're associated with the library, and then we'll go to the first question.
Okay. I'm Ellen Bruck, and I am born and bred in New York City and didn't move to Birmingham until about 16 years ago, when my daughter, who had previously moved here to go to UAB for graduate school, had already married and had a baby. And so after about a year of commuting here, my husband and I decided that we would move down to Birmingham. So I was not here on 9/11, and neither was my daughter or my husband or anybody we ever knew in our lives.
Right. Well, if you would tell us where you were on September 11th and what your how you found out what had happened and what your first impressions were.
Well, it was a beautiful September morning, and my husband and I, who were both working at the time, went to vote in the New York mayoral primary, which was occurring because Giuliani had finished his final term, and there was a primary that day, which I think Bloomberg won. Who I voted for, I don't even remember. But at any rate, my husband and I went there together, as we often did if we got up at the same time, and walked and parted at my bus stop. And I took the bus down to where I worked, which was at One Battery Plaza, which is right in the heart, right below the Wall Street, or further east of the Wall Street district, facing Battery Park, which is the park you walk through to get the Staten Island ferry, and all the ferries that you need to take to Statue of Liberty, to Ellis Island, etc.
So can I ask a question? Were you working between where people took the ferries to flee later and the World Trade Center? Yeah, okay.
I worked about 6 blocks south of the World Trade Center. And so I was on the bus, and suddenly somewhere in Chinatown, which is part way to my destination, the buses were stopped. And I had heard people talking on the bus, and they had radios, and they were talking about something happening to the World Trade Center, but nobody was very clear. They had the radio on. And so when we got off the policeman said to me, "Go start walking uptown." And I said, "You don't understand, sir. I have to go to work. And I work downtown. I have to go to work. I'll be late." And he said, "You're not going anywhere south of here." And everybody on the street was talking to everybody else and was very confused. And you could not these are the days where only a few people had a cell phone. So I didn't have a cell phone with me. And I saw people lined up for blocks around the existing telephone booths. So I was really worried about my husband, who was working midway between this point and on the way to our home. He worked in walking distance of our home. So I was able to borrow a cell phone from somebody, and I called my husband to make sure he was okay. And he said, "Yeah, I'm fine." And we started talking about what happened. And I said, "I have to give the phone back, and I'm coming to your office." And he said, "No, don't come." And I said, "I have to come." And so I walked, I guess it may have been 20 or 30 blocks from there to, and I was one of the short walks, because people had to walk over the bridges to go home to Brooklyn. They had to walk over the bridges to go to New Jersey. There was no transportation. All transportation, both air and ground, was stopped by that point in New York City. And I still didn't know the whole story, but I thought one building in the World Towers had been struck by what kind of a plane. And then I remembered when I was a little girl, a plane made a mistake. and it went into the Empire State Building. I must have been 9 or 10 at the time. And I thought, oh, some other jerk just made a mistake and flew into the Empire State Building. And I really wasn't very worried at that point. But, you know, everybody was agog and the streets were eerie and strange. And so I walked to my husband's office. And as I got there, he said, I think people were saying the second tower is going down. So at that point, he worked on Park Avenue South and 19th Street. So they were all running to the office, to the window to see what was going on. And I said, I can't see it. I won't watch it. I'll just sit here in the corner here and by myself. And they were all watching, my husband included seeing the second tower go down, which you could see from obviously a window in his office. Well, anyway, it was really eerie and scary. And by then I knew it wasn't an accident, that this was a purposeful thing. But I don't know that we knew many details until hours of the day went on.
Yeah.
And he said, I'm going to continue working. You go home. And I said, no, come home. And I said, first, we have to call our daughter, Meg, who is the person who moved down here first, but she was still living in New York. This is in 2001. And she moved to Birmingham in 2002. And at any rate, we called her and got her at her office, thank goodness. And I don't know why I said this to her. I said, she was still living home. And I said to her, please don't walk by the Empire State Building just in case it's a target. Please walk all the way east to First Avenue where the UN is. And please walk down First Avenue to our house because we lived at 23rd Street and First Avenue. So at any rate, she did. And so I was relieved. And then my husband said, well, I have to get back to work, Ellen. And I said, how are you going to work? And he said, I'm working, go home. So I went home. And the street was really, again, very weird. There were policemen out directing traffic. I lived in an ordinary neighborhood where you never had anybody directing traffic. And there were lights and that was it. But it was all official business. And of course, I went home, tuned myself to the radio and the television set, you know, to see what was going on. And
Ellen, about what time of day was this that you finally got home?
I probably got home, maybe at 10:30, 11:30, maybe by this time. And I had been apprehended when my bus was stopped.
Did you know that a second plane had hit?
No, No, we heard rumors on the bus about a first plane hitting.
Yeah.
But I found out about the second on the way, I think, or sometime after I'd gotten off the bus. And I didn't see anything. I couldn't watch it. I'm that kind of a person. So I didn't. And
were you walking towards it or away from it?
Away from it. Oh, no.
You had been walking away.
They never let me go any further down south.
That's right.
Southern Manhattan. So at any rate, I had to keep walking north. Everybody was told to walk north. And I think the bridges were kind of northeast. But at any rate, well, that would be to Brooklyn or to Queens. But the bridges to New Jersey would be all the way up at the northern tip of Manhattan. So you'd have to really walk miles. At any rate, my husband ultimately came home at about a half an hour or an hour after I did. They closed his office. And my daughter came home and she either brought a friend from her office or he came later. And he was so worried because he was worried about his son, who was about 7 and lived in New Jersey, and he couldn't reach them. And he was panicked. So eventually he stayed in our house about a couple of hours. And then he decided he was going to walk to New Jersey, which he ultimately did to find his kid. Because he was so scared, he couldn't. I think he was divorced, and his ex-wife lived there, but he couldn't reach anybody by phone. And so after we had lunch and all, we were all very antsy. So we couldn't even sit in the house. And it was a beautiful day. It was a warm day, like just this kind of weather today. And where, you can tell that fall is starting to come. And we went outside because we lived in a big development called Peter Cooper Village. And it had parks and malls and places to sit and playgrounds for kids and, paddle tennis courts and all these lovely amenities, which is one of the reasons we moved there, because it was like living in a little village within a city. And it was a nice place to bring up a kid. And so we were all sitting out on benches and we talked to strangers and neighbors you hardly knew all afternoon, all of us trying to figure out and pooling information as to what was going on. And the ensuing few weeks after that were the eeriest weeks of my life. The streets were, first of all, we didn't go back to work for a week. So we were home. That was a Tuesday. We didn't go home back to work till the next Monday. When I got to the office, the National Guard and the, I don't know if there was Army encampments, all in Battery Park. They were living in tents there and they were guarding our buildings. And they would bless me as I walked into work and I would bless them back. It was all very emotional and moving. Then when I got into my office, it smelled of burnt flesh, and we smelt it for about a week or so. And I will never forget those smells. It was just unbelievable, nothing you could ever imagine. And we'd go out at lunchtime, or I would go out, and I couldn't sit in Battery Park because that's why I often went at lunch, because it was such a lovely place to sit. Sometimes I took my lunch with me, sometimes I took a book, sometimes I just would sit and just enjoy the passing scene and watch visitors coming and going from the boats and envying them being a tourist in New York for the first time and what it might be like and stuff like that. But my whole routine was totally upset for weeks. And then if you went someplace, the streets were all full of pictures of people who had been lost at the Twin Towers. And it was eerie. It was pasted on every store window, every lamppost. You just couldn't imagine what it looked like. Have you seen this person? Please call these people if you have information. And it was just heartrending. And sometimes I would read them on the way, and sometimes I would get so sad that I just couldn't even look at them. But then you just couldn't ignore them. It was there. And then we lived near Hospital Row in New York, which meant that there were a bunch of hospitals right near us. And that's where ambulances would go. And we lived right across the street from the Veterans Hospital. Then there was Bellevue Hospital, which I'm sure you've all heard of, and then New York University Hospital. And University Hospital and Bellevue were getting the bodies, live or dead, that were found. And so we waited for the sound of ambulances, because that would mean they had a live one. If you didn't hear any sound, it was not good. And they brought the live people there. Well, we heard very few ambulance sirens. We would be so happy, we'd all but jump with joy when we heard one go up, because we said, oh, a live one. And then the street between two of the hospitals, NYU and I think Bellevue, was like a street where they put up these huge tents where they brought all the body parts and stuff. And this is where all the research work was done to find out who belonged to who. And luckily, I knew nobody who was killed in the towers. But my niece's close friend was. And she had to go with the parents and bring a hairbrush. I'll never forget this, down to wherever you took it, the hospital or whatever, for the DNA samples. They never found her, but anyway, and you just cannot believe, these were just some of the things I remembered from those days. It was eerie. There was
Mhm.
no real traffic. They allowed surface transportation. I don't know if the subways were running because I wasn't going to go into any.
Right.
So I can't remember now. There was no airplanes coming and going.
It had to have been so quiet.
New York is never that quiet. It's always noisy. There weren't big horns blaring. It was just eerie. And then you would hear the helicopters going, and you knew that you were being protected. Those were all, they weren't commercial, or if they were, they were being used by the National Guard, the Army, whatever. We were
Right.
being protected. And so we'd say, oh, good, a helicopter's going around. They'll find somebody. And then when I started going back to work, I profiled people that I saw, and I did it for a year or two to make sure that they weren't throwing the bomb or didn't have a bomb with them. I checked out subway trains. I rarely took the subway, but if I was late, I would take it because I felt safer on the buses. I figured, they're going to go down to some place safe where they can hide if they're going to bomb. They're not going to, they may bomb a bus, but it's a little hard in the crowded New York buses to get in there with your bomb. So at any rate, I started profiling people. And that's a horrible thing. My husband and I flew to New Orleans 6 months later, and there was a lady, a sweet looking lady, sitting with a burqa across the aisle from me. And I'm embarrassed to tell this story because it's so telling of the way we started feeling. And her daughter, who looked very modern, had left her at the airport. And she was sitting there kind of nervous the whole trip. And she was twisting her handkerchief and just looking off into space. And then she went to the bathroom. And she didn't come back for about a half hour. It seemed to me forever. And I said to my husband, I'll bet you she's throwing the bomb. And I'm embarrassed to say this, and if this lady is ever hearing it someplace, please accept my apologies, because that's the way we were. And when she came back to her seat, ultimately, and maybe she stopped and talked to the stewardesses in the back, I don't know, but because I often do that if I get antsy on a plane, and I felt so awful. And then my gallant husband leaves me getting my suitcase down from above us, and this lady comes over to help me, the same lady with the burqa. I was so embarrassed. I wanted to die. I wanted the floor to open up under me, and we smiled back and forth at each other. And I felt like the most terrible human being. And this is the way it was for months afterwards. And that was one of the reasons I ultimately left New York, because they used to ask my husband and I, where are you going to retire to? And we said, New York, what better place to retire to? So when we retired a couple of years later, and then by that time, my daughter was married and had a baby. So we came down, we flew down a lot to see the baby. We decided, my daughter said, oh, please move down. And she's our only child. So we said, let's try it for 2 years. And we sublet our apartment for 2 years and we moved down. And I was relieved to get out of New York because I never felt comfortable again. I just never had a good night's sleep again after that.
And you grew up in the city.
I grew up in one of the boroughs. I grew up in the Bronx, but I lived in Manhattan from my 20s on.
Yeah.
So I had been living in Manhattan for 30, 40 years by that time. And I'd gone to college in Manhattan. I'd gone to NYU. And so, and did my graduate work there and all. So, this is my hometown. This is where I lived and breathed and understood every rock on the street and every neighborhood and, what have you. And I have slept a lot better down here than I had those 2-3 years before we moved down here. And anyway, that's my story of that day and that particular time. If there's anything else you'd like to know.
Well, the one other thing I want to know is we've asked everyone to tell us what you would like maybe younger generations who were not alive then, or even people who might see this that aren't even born yet, what would you want them to know about September 11th? What would you say, remember this? And
Well, it was just the eeriest day of my life. It was just eerie, having lived in my whole life in New York and always feeling safe. And to have the sense, my safety net broken totally. And I can't be the only person that this happened to. Mm-hmm. And they kept warning you, check out packages, look for suspicious people. And you see how good I was at picking out suspicious people. And it's embarrassing to think about. And my whole sense of safety and belonging kind of got shattered. Mm-hmm. I just wanted to be with people and chat with people and, hug people and have people hug me and to feel like you belonged in this world again. Yeah. And I realized there's no place in this world where you are absolutely safe. Where I'd always walked around my whole life feeling, safe and protected. And so it took that away from me. Yeah. And I wish it hadn't happened. I never went back to look at Ground Zero till some friends of ours came into New York from California around 2004, because that was the year before we moved down here, and they wanted to go to Ground Zero. And so they were staying at a hotel down in that area because they were taking a cruise from New York to Europe the next day. And we had met them on a cruise after 9/11. So at any rate, we took them all over wherever they wanted to go. We took them to in places we thought they should see that they didn't know about. And I went over to Ground Zero and they all stood there for a long while. And I just looked for a minute and I said, I'll meet you guys outside. And I just want to remember it the way it was, the way I had been in that building. And they had a wonderful restaurant on the top floor and you could see, which was about the 110th floor or something. And you could see all over Manhattan. And who would ever think that it wasn't going to be there in a few years? I remember taking my daughter there when she was young and going with my aunt and uncle. We made a day of it. And so I just didn't want to ever look at that hole in the ground in that area if I could avoid it. And
is that the only time that you've been back since then?
To there? I've been back to New York.
No, but I mean to the memorial.
Oh, yes. It's a place I won't visit. I skirted it. Even when I went back to work and I worked only 6 blocks away, I would make sure wherever I was going, I didn't have to go by there because I was a big walker and I'd walk all over. And sometimes I would walk up several stations just to see other parts of New York. I used to like Trinity Church, which was close by, and other areas like that. And I used to just like to, snoop around. I was like Harriet the Spy, and that's a lead-in for our next discussion.
That's excellent.
But I was a kid like her. I grew up just that way, with lots of freedom and always, spying around to see what was doing. And I could identify with that, And so I really always avoided that area like the plague. Yeah.
Well, Ellen, I really appreciate you telling your story. I know that's got to be hard to think about it again. I wish it hadn't happened too, but I really do appreciate you telling us all your memories, especially the details make a big difference, I think, especially as someone the couple of people that we've interviewed here who actually were in New York, were there doing recovery efforts and cleanup and trying to put the fire out. So they were there on into October. So the details of that day are something that we don't have at all, except from you. So I really appreciate that.
I'm glad, that I was able to help. I will not watch any remembrances. I have them in my
Yeah.
head,
Yeah.
and I won't watch any of the programs on television. I will look at the film you do just out of curiosity. I'll make sure to see it. And but I will make believe it kind of never happened,
Yeah.
because this has brought it all up. It's enough remembrance for a while.
Yeah.
For a while.
Yeah.
And, I will be like Rip Van Winkle and sleep through it.